This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan, and I am here with Dr. Steven Pinker, who has been on the podcast before. So most of you probably know who he is. So he is a Johnstone Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. He's written a bunch of books. He writes a bunch of stuff. Steven's out there. And I wanted to talk to him. So previous time, we talked about his book on rationality. It's kind of like appropriate to the time and like what he had out at the time. But I want to talk now in 2023 as we're recording about The Blank Slate, which is, I don't know, there's a lot of, you've written a lot of great books, Steven, but Blank Slate seems to be, can I say that that's your breakout in terms of you became like a kind of like a next level public intellectual after that? You were kind of the psycholinguist, evolutionary psychologist, and then you wrote a book on human nature. I mean, is that correct characterization?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I wanted to talk to Steven about The Blank Slate, more than 20 years later now. When I read The Blank Slate as a young man, there wasn't anything I necessarily disagreed with it or that I was shocked by, but I think it clarified a lot of things. It introduced many of us to thinkers like Judith Rich Harris, the late Judith Rich Harris. I mean, that was a big deal. I mean, if I have told people read The Blank Slate at least to be introduced to Judith Rich Harris, like that's the minimum. There's other things in there, obviously, but I do think that was great of you, to make her more well known to people. And The Blank Slate, it's divided into basically three themes, I guess. So the blank slate itself, talking about behavior genetics, that sort of thing, evolutionary psychology, the ghost in the machine, which, like kind of like the dualism, the idea that people have souls and, maybe like, questions related to free will. And then there's the noble savage, which, comes kind of through Rousseau, but has been around in the culture in various ways related to kind of like utopian ideas of the plasticity of our nature and our nature being fundamentally good. And so I wanted to talk about these things in sequence. More than 2 decades later, we've talked a little bit, in the previous podcast about how things are today and like looking back. And when I read The Blank Slate, so I'll just say, let's start with the behavior genetics part. When I read The Blank Slate, I knew some of what you had written about, but I got exposed to a lot more of the literature. And so, for example, Judith Rich Harris, who I just mentioned, she talked about, or she reported results that are pretty robust, that shared environmental effects. So what your family, how your family's choices shape who you are, as opposed to the genetics of who your family is, and as opposed to non-shared environment, which is basically a residual. It's everything else. She thought it was peer groups, but that's still a hypothesis being tested. That was kind of a revelation. It's influenced a lot of people. I know Brian Kaplan's book about why selfish reasons to have kids. Like there's a lot of books out there that were influenced by that sort of thinking. And then obviously you talked about heritability, and this was 20 years ago, before educational attainment 3, 4, all of these things had happened. And now we have a whole science based on genome-wide associations and complex trait analysis in genomics, looking at the material biophysical substrate that produces heritability, which is just the variation of the population due to genes. All of these ideas. So like starting out with a blank slate, I think you teed it up for the next 20 years. On the other hand, entirely honestly, I feel like something has happened in our culture, and I can tell you that many people who have graduate level backgrounds still will tell me, well, I don't think IQ, well, one, IQ is not real. Okay, so you start there. 2, if it's real, it's not heritable. In terms of Judith Rich Harris and shared environment, they don't know any of that. A lot of the behavior genetics is perceived to be, quote, problematic. That's the term we would use today. Paige Harden had a book, and it was a book explicitly avowing wokeness, but she was attacked as a eugenicist by people on the left. I feel like of the various things, starting out with the blank slate, we have many more discoveries, but the culture is much more avowedly blank slate than it was 20 years ago. Am I wrong?
Yeah, there are different strands of the culture. So by and large, you're right. And also things have changed a bit over time. So in the first 15 years after the blank slate came out, the idea was a little less taboo in the sense that you could open up an intro psych textbook and there'd be a discussion of behavioral genetics and heritability and sex differences. That probably was less likely to have been true 20 years ago, 25 years ago. In newspaper op-eds, columnists, they would sometimes talk about the evolutionary basis of a trait. They might mention heritability. And so the window opened somewhat, but then after 2020, as you know, there's been a huge backlash, and in some ways, the kind of moral revulsions against the very idea of human nature has spread outward, so that even, for example, many cultural explanations are now taboo in favor of attributing everything to bigotry, racism, transphobia, prejudice, and so on. So if I can just take a step back, the reason I wrote The Blank Slate was after having written How the Mind Works, I saw that a lot of the pushback against the very idea that there's such a thing as human nature and the ways in which it was being fleshed out by evolutionary psychology and cognitive and affective neuroscience and behavioral genetics, a lot of the opposition wasn't just scientific. There was a scientific opposition there, that's good and proper, but a lot of it was moralistic. It was we that can't be reality because it would just be too awful to think about if that was true. The moralistic fallacy that reality has to conform with our values, our dreams of what would be the best world we'd want to live in. And I especially appreciated after I wrote Rationality, the idea that I think you and I have, that most people who sign on to science at least ought to have, that journalists ought to have, is there's a real world, it's out there, it doesn't care particularly about our values. As James Flynn of the Flynn Effect said, the truth can't be racist, and likewise the truth can't be sexist. But at the same time, as Chekhov said, I should have used this as an epigraph for the book, man will be better if you show him what he is like. Now, nothing that we can discover about human nature would compromise basic commitments like all people have equal rights, like we ought to work to reducing scourges like violence and exploitation, like human life has meaning and dignity and purpose. You can have all those things at the same time as you find out what makes us tick and accept whatever the truth turns out to be. But that mindset that there is a distinction between facts and values, that there is a moral value of finding out empirical reality about the world, including ourselves, so as to inform our values, more and more I've come to realize that is a weird, exotic, delicate mindset, and that it isn't just non-Western peoples, isn't just uneducated peoples, it's people with the highest position, the highest degrees of education, the highest degrees of responsibility for our institutional and intellectual institutions. They fall back on the idea that when it comes to particularly human nature, you can't really find out, and so let's advance the view that is as morally uplifting as possible, as edifying as possible. So that was what I was pushing against when I wrote The Blank Slate, and that has gotten, I'd say, worse. So just if I could just recap why I wrote the different sections of The Blank Slate. The Blank Slate itself is the idea that we have no inborn talents or motives or emotions. And I kind of diagnosed the appeal of The Blank Slate, the moral appeal, despite the fact that There are obvious reasons to think it's false, like we're not chimpanzees, like not all of us are identical, the results of behavioral genetics, that men and women aren't indistinguishable, despite a lot of social and cultural forces trying to make us interchangeable. We still aren't. A lot of our tastes are adapted to a pre-modern environment, not to the costs and benefits of our current environment. All those are reasons to think that the blank slate is wrong, but people want to believe the blank slate, I think, is they think that it's the ultimate guarantor of equality, because kind of from the truism that 0 equals 0 equals 0, if we're all blank slates, we have to be equal. If anything's written on the slate, some of us could have more than others, and and that would be too terrible to think about, because that would mean that discrimination and oppression are okay after all. So my point was, that doesn't follow. That's a non sequitur. We can be committed, as the founders of American democracy were, to the idea that all people are created equal in terms of their rights, without saying that we're all clones. We don't have to be clones in order to have equal rights. As long as we treat individuals as individuals and don't prejudge them by the statistics of a group, the statistics of a group are irrelevant to the political commitment to equality. But that's I have learned, a very hard message to get to sink in, to the point where, when it comes to the most incendiary possible implication of human nature, namely, could races differ, a topic that I did not discuss in the blank slate. I don't think there's strong enough evidence. I don't think it's scientifically important enough. But there's such revulsion against even the possibility that might be true, that the very idea of intelligence has been dismissed by a lot of our intellectuals. As you note, there's still the myth debunked decades ago, promulgated by Stephen Jay Gould, that IQ tests don't measure intelligence, that there's no such thing as intelligence, that intelligence predicts nothing. And I think that is trying to build several rings around the possibility that races differ by saying, well, there is no such thing, so they couldn't differ. But it has bled so far that what used to be the politically correct alternative to innate differences in race, namely cultural differences, well, that's taboo now too, because that's blaming the victim, and the only acceptable explanation for any group-wide differences is racism or homophobia or transphobia or sexism. Even the cultural differences, which used to be the acceptable alternative to biological differences, well, even that is taboo. So it isn't just the blank slate. It's more generally trying to make reality conform to the easiest shortcut to equality. My argument in that part of the book was, let's just be clear as to what our commitment is. And yes, discrimination is bad, and oppression is bad, and exploitation is bad. But the results from your population study, your behavioral genetics study, no matter which way they come out, don't compromise the ideal of political and moral equality. So that was the blank slate part. Things haven't, as you note, haven't gotten better. You still have intellectuals who are reiterating the canards from Gould from his Mismeasure of Man book, even though they were debunked within a few months of the book being published. You still find people not in discussions of economic inequality. The vast majority, 9 out of 10 or more, don't even mention the possibility that some people might be more conscientious than others. Some people might be smarter than others. It's simply not even mentioned, even to be refuted. It's unmentionable. That has not gotten better, at least in the last few years, although there was an opening, I think, in the decade after the book came out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot out there, and that's true. I mean, I do have to say, I think you alluded a little bit to this, maybe more the ghost of the machine part. Intelligent design creationism, that was a thing 20 years ago. George W. Bush had just been elected, so it was a whole different time. Like, there's people who are going to be listening to us, and I mean, just like they don't remember 9/11. Like, that's a thing now.
Yeah.
So okay, so they don't understand what the environment is, and I do think one of the let's outline, especially for non-Americans, because some of those things we're going to be talking about is American specific. Now, this idea that Ibram X. Kendi is proposing is that any differences between, okay, this is not true. It's not a general assertion, but any differences between blacks and whites that do not, where there's a gap that's, people would want to shrink the gap, let's say test scores, achievements on various like academic performance, whatever. There's only one explanation. And that explanation is systemic racism. Now, on the one hand, it's an easy concept to understand, but on the other hand, it's almost like the ether or karma or God. It is a force in the universe that is hidden and shaping everything around us. And it is the ultimate cause. And so I just think in some ways, we're seeing, instead of the overthrow of the blank slate, understanding of human nature, it's almost like a re-enchantment of the universe with these sociological forces. And yes, they're not explicitly made supernatural, but once you try to define it, it is very similar to theological debates where you cannot really define God because God is beyond comprehension and understanding.
Yeah, God isn't the kind of guy that would make himself comprehensible to us. So if you think you understand him, you don't understand him. Yes, and in the case of, the blank slate did not discuss race, but ironically, what was for a while called the cultural turn in sociology, and I'm talking to you here from William James Hall at Harvard, where we have a psychology department and a sociology department in the same building, and my very good friend and colleague Orlando Patterson, who's a couple of floors down, wrote about a couple of decades ago, around the time that I wrote The Blank Slate. He gave me comments on it. He wrote about the cultural turn in sociology, something that actually he kind of hoped for, namely, culture is important. Not every ethnic group has the same set of norms and mores and habits and equilibria, and sociology should pay more attention to it. And he noted Riley in his book, The Ordeal of Integration, came out in 1999. The fact that back then, in his own field, the culture was already starting to become suspects. It seemed like blaming the victim, and that the only explanation was racism. And Orlando Patterson pointed that out in 1999, but that was kind of a dot on the horizon when he wrote presciently, and now it has exploded. Just going back to the blank slate for a moment, but another manifestation, I mean, aside from just the denial of the possibility of individual differences. And again, forget race. Let's just talk about individuals. Some people are more neurotic than others, and some people are more conscientious than others, and some people are more agreeable than others. That is often taboo. Some people are smarter than others. Then there's, of course, the difference between the sexes, which has, again, a lot of discussions in disparities in representation in different professions. Don't even mention the possibility that men and women, on average, of course, not every last individual, but if you compare the means, they're not identical in their priorities, their tastes, their interests, their portfolio of talents. Again, not true of every man and every woman, but on average, there are differences. That possibility is often not even mentioned when you find that someone reports that there are more, proportionally more women in psychology, more men in mechanical engineering. So that hasn't gotten any better, I don't think. And in fact, in some ways, as with the bleed out into cultural explanations, the bleed out in this case, or the diffusion or spreading, is it used to be not okay to talk about any innate sex differences, although ironically, it was always politically okay to talk about innate differences in sexual orientation. That was one of the exceptions where the blank slate theory was what the right-wingers believe, and if you were a progressive in good standing, you believe that homosexual orientation is innate, at least in men. But now you have the transgender phenomenon, where it's not only which traits you have that are not a matter of your chromosomes and your gametes, but even the sex that you identify with, that itself has nothing to do with your biological endowment. It's either, maybe it's the ghost in the machine, maybe your soul is male or female and doesn't accept the body it had the bad luck to be incarnated in, or I don't think it's a particularly coherent view of where sexual identity comes from, gender identity, I should say. But that's a case where two ideas that have gotten far more extreme and far more in departure from a biologically grounded understanding. Even two sexes is now controversial. My colleague Carol Hoop got canceled for saying that biologically speaking, there are two sexes.
Yeah, I mean, so Carol's been on the podcast. I've talked to her. Like, we've hung out at the Quillette conference too. So, she's great. And I told it's a long time ago, but in 2014, I could tell something was up. I was in graduate school at the time. I ran into Chris Mooney, who had written the Republican War on Science, and I'm just like, you people are going to come after sex. And I just met the left, and he just started laughing. He's like, dude, that's done. The science wars are over. Who's right, Chris? Who was right? I was totally right. The idea of there being sex differences was kind of like, I feel like that's where evolutionary psychologists started. This is so manifestly self-evidently true that there are men and there are women and they are different, that this is where you start. Yeah on average, although when you look at upper body strength, they're quite close to disjoint, which I believe most people in like upper middle class professional managerial class backgrounds in the United States are not aware of this, because, to be entirely candid, it's extremely taboo for like a man to hit a woman in that sort of cultural environment. And this is like, again, I'm going to be generalizing about cultures, but sorry, it's not taboo in some other cultures. So they know very clearly the difference between males and females in upper body strength. I do not think we do, actually, in a lot of, because
it's a beneficial taboo. I'm glad we have it, but it also mean that there are certain biological realities that people are less familiar with. I think
exactly.
Well, when you're a kid and you play in sport, especially in the era in which there were pickup teams and where not every childhood activity was regimented by adults, and you'd play mixed sex teams, it became pretty obvious that there, with some exceptions, there are always some super strong athletic girls, but on average you don't have a boys team against a girls team.
Yeah, and that's common sense. Although, in the last, I think I first heard about it in 2016 or 2015. There are sociologists, of course it's going to be sociologists, sorry, who are arguing for the elimination of all gender or sex. I don't know what word they want to use now because it's always changing. Separation in the NCAA. And I'll look this up and I'll try to put in the show notes. I was listening to NPR. I think this one I was in Davis, so that means it was before 2016 or 17. And the NPR reporter was, well, I mean, don't you think that men and women are kind of different? And sociologist, she was at University of Alabama. She had played NCAA basketball. She said, you know what? This sort of segregation, they used to argue about that for races. And so the reporter was, okay, let's move on. Because she knew how to rhetorically,
There is a phenomenon that, and this came up when I wrote The Better Angels of Our Nature, that people do sometimes beneficially transfer lessons from from one struggle for justice and equality to another, not acknowledging the differences. And it is true that, say, sexism and the women's rights revolution came on the heels of racism and the civil rights revolution. And that was good, and then gay rights in turn borrowed some of the tactics, some of the mentality. But although the moral transfer was relevant, it should be okay also to acknowledge where you got to make some substitutions and differences. The black and white, male and female, they're not the same. There's, as far as we know, black and white could be biologically interchangeable except for skin pigmentation. That could be perfectly plausible, but that just is not true for the sexes going back, a couple of billion years. And race is really well, you've written much about it, how it's very recent, and we are all mongrels. We're all just
I
amazing.
think that's a problematic term, but I
It is.
will.
I wear it proudly. I think
Okay.
we should all be proud of being mongrels because it means that race,
Yeah,
this is a case where, there is some truth to it's not completely true, but that there's no biological reality to race.
sure.
Just statistically, there's a little bit, but it's pretty superficial. Whereas male and female, that really goes back a long ways in our evolutionary history, and that really
Sure.
is biologically significant in a way that race is it's a bunch of at most variation in allele frequencies. But anyway,
Yeah,
that
I mean,
got better, and again, I think it's uh, a confusion. It's lazy moral thinking that it really is bad for women to be exploited, for women to be harassed, women to be assaulted, for women to be discriminated against. Those are all evils. We should fight them. Both sexes should fight them. We should try to combat them in many different ways. None of it depends on men and women being indistinguishable. But because rewind the clock 60 years, and a lot of the arguments for treating women differently hinged on bogus theories of sex differences. Women can't, they can't reason abstractly, and they can't do math, and so good riddance to those. And indeed, those did prop up a lot of discrimination and oppression. But on the other hand, it doesn't mean that men and women have to be indistinguishable in every respect for you to be opposed to sexism and assault, physical assaults on women, and all the other evils. So again, it's a kind of lazy moral thinking that commandeers or takes over empirical scientific thinking. You're forcing reality to be be such that it gives you a kind of cheap shortcut toward your political goals.
hmm
At least
well, so
that's the argument in The Blank Slate. Yeah.
yeah, well, I mean, I have to say, so a couple of years after the Blank Slate came out, let's like again talk about history. What's happened in this 21st century. I think 2004, the Larry Summers affair, um,
It was early
variance
or early
male,
05, yeah.
yeah, the variance
Also
of
just down the street from where I am sitting at
yeah.
this very moment.
So I think of that as a bit of a turning point because Larry Summers is a mainstream intellectual. Arguably, many people argue that he never became chair of the Federal Reserve because of that incident. Just to recap, there were some discussions about the representation of women in science, and Larry Summers mooted the possibility that maybe this is due to differences in the variance in mathematical aptitude, males having higher variance, females having lower variance, even though the average is the same. So males would be more represented at the tails, top and bottom. Okay, this is an idea he put out there. It was a part of a broader suite of issues the faculty had with Summers. He was no longer president, and it's dogged him in various ways for a couple of decades. But today, look, I think that men and women have different cognitive profiles. The details, I'm not a psychometrician, but I think that's true objectively. But
On
it's not
average.
something
I
that,
mean,
yeah, on average,
there's lots of exceptions.
on average, yes, and I know those exceptions. But
And
my
me
daughter,
too.
yeah, my
I was
daughter has a, yeah, go on.
I was married to a woman whose 3D spatial cognition just trounced me, left me in the
Yeah,
dust. Uh,
yes. I know what
and
you're saying.
I'm
Okay,
happy and happy that that's true. It's diversity. And there's
yeah,
diversity between sexes. There's diversity within sexes, which we should celebrate.
we should be inclusive of all this diversity, to
We
use
should
some.
be inclusive. That's
but
good.
this is not a discussion that I can bring up anymore because I know it's a non-starter. Not that I'm not like shy to bring it up, but we have moved the Overton window, to use another word, so much in our culture that there are a lot of things that I just don't, there's no point in bringing up because people frankly flip out at me,
Yeah.
And so it's like, whatever. I'm just like, I'm just kind of like shrug. And I think there's a lot of things that it's like that where we just don't bother to because the defenses and, the group think and whatever. I mean, so for example, let's go back to Catherine Page Hardin's book. This was an explicitly left-wing book in many ways, or the intent, and I know her some. She's a very left-wing person. And she tried really hard. I mean, I think she was explicit, she was honest about it. She told me she tried really hard for it not to be interpreted in an invidious, racial way, right?
Yeah.
Even if you read, she explicitly rejects a lot of things in there. Well, it doesn't matter. She's called a white supremacist. She's called a eugenicist. It doesn't matter. So why would anyone want to talk about this?
Exactly right. By the way, in her book, which was in many ways quite brilliant, and some of the arguments I actually anticipated in The Blank Slate, where I had a section in the chapter on politics. That is
Yes.
why, in general, historically, there is a little bit of an affinity with human nature innateness on the right and with plasticity in The Blank Slate on the left. But I ended that, and I asked the question, why should that be? But I ended the chapter with how that alignment was being broken down. I talked about a number of innatist leftists or Darwinian leftists, Noam Chomsky, an obvious example, Peter Singer, Herb Gintis, and I did mention some of the arguments that Hardin picked up in her book as to why, even if you believe that people do have inborn differences among individuals, why that could be a call for compensatory measures, for explicitly trying to reduce economic inequality for moral reasons, because no one chose or earned or deserved their innate endowment.
Yep.
She ran with that argument, and I did mention it. So, and to her credit, she does separate the empirical state of affairs from the political and moral. She I thought did it very well. It didn't save her from idiotic attack from the New York Review of Books, which for about 50 years has had idiotic attacks on. It's been kind of the vanguard or the establishment, the empire striking back consistently for any claim that there is any biological, genetic, evolutionary basis to anything. They're the enforcer of the blank slate dogma. And
Yeah.
it was true when Gould was one of their, and Richard Lewontin were their major repeated contributors. Now it's been picked up by Marcus Feldman, and Paige Hardin was the victim of that.
Yeah. So that was I don't even want to. That really angered me, but I'll post a link to that exchange actually also in the notes. There's a lot of stuff that's happening. I apologize to the people out there. I'm being a little negative. There's a lot of great science that's happened. We know so much more, but we do so little with it. I want to shut off the blank slate and I want to move on to Ghost Machine, but I do want to say, it is from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. That presupposes that there's variation in abilities.
Yes, there is.
Just putting it out there.
You can agree or disagree with that, but that what you said is exactly right. One could defend that while acknowledging that people differ in their abilities and in their needs. By the way, we didn't just one other thing on the Noble Savage, which was the second in the that kind of trilogy.
I was gonna talk about
Okay,
Noble
we'll wait
Savage
for that.
last.
Okay,
we'll talk about Noble Savage
we'll get
last.
to that. Very good. We'll go to
I think I have the spiciest takes on that, so I'll just put it in the last.
Okay, very good.
Okay, so Ghost of the Machine. Obviously, this is about soul and just like ideas of maybe consciousness or human self that have to do with the duality, that we have a spiritual, that we're basically immaterial spirits animating a body. So this is a little bit like Cartesian dualism in the philosophical sense, but really a lot of people have a strong intuition about ghosts and all these other things. And I think this is inextricably tied in American mentality or psychology to religion. And when you were writing around the year 2000, there was already evidence in the CUNY surveys that there was some erosion of religious belief in the United States, but most people did not know that and were not paying attention. I remember reading, what was it? Guy who did Huntington, his last book, Who We Are, I think. And it was 2004, and he just was not. I was pointing out like there's evidence of like some erosion. It wasn't in his like. I emailed Tierney, I think, at the New York Times in 2007. No, bro, we're getting more secular, and he just rejected it. Now I think everyone accepts it. Like there's been a massive disaffiliation with organized religion within the last 15 years. New atheism did not succeed, but it left some serious bruises. When it comes to the generations below the Zoomers, like the largest cohort are no religion now. A lot more people are saying they're atheists. When I was younger, there were a lot of people who basically were atheists, where if you asked them, they didn't really believe in God, but they wouldn't want to use the word because of association with communism and radicalism. Today, it's not as big of a deal. So a lot of the issues around religion in particular have been attenuated. Creationism, intelligent design are out there, but they're very, very toothless compared to what they were, with all like the court cases and other things. Social conservatives have lost a lot of wars. Like, let's set aside the recent abortion ruling, which that's a separate, judicial issue. But social conservatives have lost a lot of ground in the last 20 years. Religion has lost a lot of ground. Materialist, naturalistic understandings of the universe are much less taboo. It's not a big deal that Bernie Sanders is quite clearly a secular Jew with the bold-faced capital secular. Like, nobody makes a big deal about it. Donald J. Trump, yeah, he was Christian, wink, wink. Probably one of the most secular presidents we've ever had. He clearly has no idea about Christianity, no offense. And Obama, in his biography, said that he believed in evolution more than he believed in angels. So I feel like, in terms of the ghost in the machine, in the official ways, we really moved on. But this isn't, Richard Dawkins is not very popular on the left today. The new atheists are not, they're problematic. People like you who I think espouse like Carl Sagan, 1990s demon haunted world. We know what we're talking about. Secular humanists, kind of objective reality, science will, bring a better future understanding of ourselves, understanding of the universe. And the superstition will fade away. Well, I mean, I think organized religion has faded away, but you can call it a different word. But superstition, I don't know. I mean, some of these discussions that I have with people, I mean, I don't want us to both get canceled for the 27th time, but like the gender stuff. Okay, what is this but the ghost in the machine, the dualism? Like, what we're born with male or female souls. This is what they're talking about. They don't say it in those words, and like the people will probably say that they're atheists, many of them, if you ask them. But what do they believe in? Like, what is their intuition here?
Yeah, well, I think this is an idea that Paul Bloom ran with in his book Descartes' Baby, and another cognitive scientists and developmental psychologists, that because we deal with each other interpersonally by imputing minds to others, that is, I don't treat you like a robot, I don't treat you like a wind-up doll, I don't treat you like a piece of meat. I assume that in there somewhere there is this locus of beliefs and desires and consciousness, just like I have. I kind of deal with you mind to mind. And from there, it's a short step from everyone has a mind and a body to think, well, maybe there can be minds without bodies. And so you have belief in souls and gods and spirits and ESP and clairvoyance. They do come naturally to us, and then they get formalized in religions. Now, in terms of the temporal trajectory of religion, I looked at this when I wrote Enlightenment Now. And what you say is right, that there's been a huge falling off from organized religion. It was slow for Americans to notice because America lagged the rest of the affluent democracies. We were slow in moving away from religion, but we caught up. So the number of religiously affiliated people has been in sharp decline. It doesn't mean, though, that people who used to be Methodists are now atheists. As you noted, people don't like the word atheist. It sounds like amoral. And also, one thing that I've discovered is that the mindset that someone immersed in science has, where you want a kind of coherent picture of the universe and us in it. Namely, there was the Big Bang, and 13.7 billion years ago, and the universe is governed by the gravitation and the electroweak force and the strong force and leptons and hadrons, and we're products of evolution, and our consciousness comes from our brain. That whole kind of continuous story where we're bothered when there's something that's inconsistent and we try to resolve it. We consider it to be an area of research. But that whole demand for intellectual consistency is very exotic. Most people live with all kinds of vagueness and contradictions and paradoxes. They're just, they have other things to worry about. And so the people who are fallen away from religion, it's not that they would say they were atheists. And you can say, well, wait a second, either you believe in God or you don't. But for many people, it's like, well, I'm spiritual, but not religious. And maybe there's a higher force. And, don't ask me the theological details. I haven't thought that much about it. And so people are in this limbo where they're not atheists, but they don't believe that Jesus was the Son of God and died for our sins either. Now, one of the reasons that this secularization has gone unnoticed, one of them was that America was lagging. Second is that I think all over the world, people who are religious have more unprotected sex. They have more babies. And so fertility rates are hugely different between the secular and the religious. And so in many countries, even though when people change their religious affiliation, it's one way from religious to irreligious. On the other hand, the religious make up for it by having more children. And then the third reason that it's hard to appreciate that people tend towards becoming more secular with modernization is that at least in the United States and else in several other parts of the world, the religions are really well organized. That one of the reasons that people fall away from religion is they fall away from any institution. They're just disengaged. They don't belong to the Elks or the Kiwanis or the Boy Scouts or the bowling leagues. They sit home and they stream movies. People who are religious often will do it with others, and they'll be politically organized and monolithic, and they'll vote. So the evangelicals are outnumbered by the so-called nuns, and that is, by the way, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. That is no religion when you ask them. But the thing is that the evangelicals all vote and the nuns don't. They stay home. So the political power doesn't reflect the sheer numbers. That's another reason why the secularization is often unnoticed.
Well, so speaking of secularization, I mentioned new atheism. Were you at the Beyond Belief?
I missed that, but my other half, Rebecca Goldstein, was at it.
Okay, yeah, it's like
she's also lumped in.
So Beyond Belief. You guys can Google it. There's Beyond Belief 1, Beyond Belief 2. If you are the type of person who loves Carl Sagan, Steven Pinker, you read Stephen Hawking, you'd love Beyond Belief. Like, I feel it captured a point in our culture where this sort of like scientifically informed secular humanism, that's what I'll call it. New atheism was the more edgy part of it, but it wasn't exclusively new atheism. They had like a discourse between people like Atron and Sam Harris, Scott Atron. So that's 2007, 2008. Ani Drian was there, Carl Sagan's widow. And I feel like sometime in the early teens, like right around the early awakening, that whole movement shattered, and there was like a rump that's still kind of like, let's call it old school, like Dawkins, Harris. And then there's other people, and it started with something called Atheism Plus, Atheism and Social Justice, and really it was just mostly about social justice. And it seems that some of the energies that were knocking against evangelical conservative hegemony in the 2000s, remember, for the listeners out there, George W. Bush, this was arguably the peak of evangelical power in America. And it's kind of like one of those things where it's the peak, it was, like hubris before the fall, because, there was all this anti-gay marriage initiatives and stuff. And look where we are now, everything that they found precious has been like ripped away. And now we're like, denying male versus female. I mean, they're going crazy right now, but, maybe this is a counteraction. But a lot of the people that were opposing that, the liberals, the secularists, the atheists, now many of them, like, how do I say this? When I was growing up, I'm atheist. I'm pretty candid about my views. I'd get into arguments with people, and religious people seem so self-righteous, just like really annoying. And now I can't be pointing fingers because I encounter many, many supposedly free-thinking atheists that are the most incredibly smug, self-righteous people in the world. So I don't know. I'm just like putting that out there. 20 years on, I'm really not sure if the secularization, like Richard Dawkins would be like, what if we had a world with no religion? Well, there's some,
Imagine no religion. It wasn't
yeah, yeah.
Dawkins wasn't the
And I'm
first
just
to
like,
say it.
yeah, I'm not, yeah, exactly. I'm not sure if,
Lenin
yeah,
comment 1970.
yeah. Lenin, Lenon, just for the not Lenin, just
Yes.
just for the people out there. But anyway, I threw a
But
lot out there. I mean, how are
yeah,
you feeling? You've seen this happen.
yeah. So when it comes to the people, like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and the Center for Inquiry, I actually don't, and the Skeptic magazine, I would not call them self-righteous. I don't think they are. However, what has happened is that a lot of and I think this may be what you're calling attention to, is that some of the moral and political energy that went into secular movements got diverted to so-called social justice, wokeism, identity politics. We see this most clearly with the American Humanist Association, which actually revoked Richard Dawkins' Humanist of the Year award because he said, how come you can choose your gender, but you can't choose your race if race is a biological construct, referring to the Rachel Dolezal scandal. For that, they revoked the AHA, revoked his Humanist of the Year, even though if you look at past Humanist of the Year winners, they include Alice Walker, a vicious anti-Semite and conspiracy kook. They include Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist. They include B.F. Skinner, who called autistic people biological mistakes. They include Thomas Szasz, who was funded by tobacco and had a number of noxious beliefs. So there are all kinds of kooks and characters over the years whose Humanist of the Year award was not revoked. But Dawkins, for just asking the question, what's the difference, they tried to cancel him. This was the clearest example of humanism, which was the idea to have, as my colleague at Harvard, Greg Epstein, put it, good without God. So it was a locus of a lot of secularist energy in the first decade of the 21st century, but now it's basically the American Woke Association. The international humanists are much better. They've stuck to the program more consistently. But you're right that I think that, I mean, it's a lot of institutions. We've seen previously sound institutions which have been just sapped and stained by wokeism. The American Civil Liberties Union, Planned Parenthood, the Southern Poverty Law Center, American Humanist Association, kind of ruined as organizations in terms of their original mission because of the creep of wokeism. Now, it may be part of what I don't know if you're familiar with Conquest's Third Law from the historian Robert Conquest. Any institution that is not explicitly on the right goes to the left. Interesting why that would be true, but that seems to be true of a lot of our philanthropic organizations that formerly had very clear missions, but now have become identity politics workshops.
Yeah, so we're talking about identity politics now. So I want to get, and this was the second of your three things, but I wanted to like save it for last because it might be the spiciest. So Noble Savage, identity politics. So I think, you said wokeism. What is that? A lot of people argue about what wokeism is. I think it's hard to deny that wokeism and identity politics are strongly connected. Identity politics existed long before wokeism, but it's a core plank, right? It's the collective identity of groups are very, very important, as opposed to, like I would say, hey, I'm talking to my friend Steve. He's Canadian, he's Jewish, blah, 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 whatever. I don't really care.
Male cisgender straight.
Yeah, but now, yeah, exactly. Now it's like all of these things are like super important. And so I'll tell this story really quickly because I think some of the listeners have heard this. I grew up in the United States in the 1980s, 1990s, and in the 80s, people would ask me like once a week where I came from and like how I can speak English so well, and I would explain to them. And they'd be like, "Oh, but you don't have an accent." And I'm like, "Well, I'd explain to them." Critical period. I didn't know what a critical period was, but let's just say I knew. Okay. 90s, it's happened like once a month, maybe even less, tend to be boomers. 2000s kind of faded away. Okay. And I was like, oh, this is like, I'm American now. I mean, like, I've been a citizen for a while, but now people don't look at me and they don't think anything, The last 5 years, it's come back. Like, people have really started to care about where I'm from, what my race, and, what my all these things. And these are mostly, woke people, I guess what I would say. I don't hang out with many conservatives. Well, I do, but, not the type of people I grew up with. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, it's from like liberal people. So identity politics, like, this is what I tell, a lot of woke people. It's like, I don't want white people to be obsessing about race. That's just not good, at least for me,
It's
And
really
so,
not,
yeah, it doesn't have a good track record.
It does not have a good track. That is, yes. So pigeonholing people into racial categories and treating them as indistinguishable representatives of a single set of beliefs on the basis of the color of their skin, no good can come of that. We kind of thought we were over it, or at least surmounting it, not over it, obviously.
We were aspiring to something
We were
better.
aspiring.
We had a goal.
And yeah, and so that you can't predict someone's opinions based on their racial categorization. That was really a triumph of humanity, a true example of moral progress, that people were not subjected to racial or less so to racial stereotyping and bias and discrimination and oppression. Hooray for that as far as it went. Let's try to make it go farther. But as you point out, that's not the direction we've seen, especially in the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. Go on, Stephen.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see people like Coleman Hughes, like John McWhorter, renew the case for moral colorblindness. That is, individuals ought to be treated as individuals and not prejudged by the category they happen to fall into. I until recently I thought that was a no-brainer, until I saw the New York Times starting to write about whiteness and calling attention to the fact that an author is white, which not so long ago was kind of taboo. Like, when you're reviewing someone's book, unless it's about their experience as Indian American or an African American or whatever, you don't call attention to their race. It's kind of rude or it's racist. Now, then, just about starting maybe about 5 years ago, that happened when it came to commentators who were white. Like, well, of course he says that he's white. That's the kind of thing that we're sick of white people telling us this, that, or the other thing. Despite the fact there's a lot of diversity in white opinion, as there's a lot of diversity in black opinion and Asian opinion, and I mean, kind of
what used to be. I honestly, I don't even like I have like a shiver just hearing you say white opinion and black opinion and Asian opinion.
Well, yeah, me too. Yeah.
Right?
As I was saying,
like I'm not saying that like you're saying it because you want to say it, but like this is how we talk today.
No, it's ugly. It is. Yeah. It's evil. I completely agree. But going back to so what took us to this point? So let's try.
Well, I'm just talking. So identity politics, Noble Savage. One thing I will just give a really quick. Yeah. Really quick anecdote of like where I think the Noble Savage has come back. And the Noble Savage is this idea, we were like these good, noble people, blah, 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 innate natures. I've read that apparently before European colonialism, male and female were not ideas that we colored people knew. That's what I've heard. Now, you can talk to my grandparents and they will explain we always do, but there's this like weird idea that we were in a state of nature, that we were inclusive and we had gender diversity, and it was the evil white people that introduced into the Garden of our Eden all of the oppression and hierarchy. That's where I think the Noble Savages really come back, in terms of removing agency from non-white peoples, turning them into blank slates of noble savage utopias that were touched by the influence of colonialism, part of systemic racism. White people are the only agents in the world, and they're agents of evil. So just throw that out there. That's what I hear.
I mean, no. I hear it as well. So there is some noble savage in in that assumption. Of course, in surveys, ethnographic surveys of cross-cultural diversity and universals, the idea that men and women have different natures is pretty close to a human universal. And the stories of sex-reversed cultures have turned out to be academic legends. Now, of course, there is diversity in gender roles across cultures. There's been a huge change in my own lifetime in this culture. So things can change, but the culture in which the women as a sex wield the political power, are more physically aggressive, where all division of labor is sex blind, those cultures almost certainly don't exist. The other, of course, manifestation of the noble savage recently is the idea of defunding the police, or of reacting to the genuine need for reform in American policing, which there clearly is. Our police beat up and shoot too many people. Nonetheless, the way that discussion should be framed is, how do we minimize the number of innocent people who are harmed by police while preserving their absolutely necessary function of keeping the predators from exploiting everyone else? And only if you believe in the noble savage could you even think for a microsecond about the insanity of defunding the police. Police are really good, although American police really do harm people above and beyond their mandate of preventing people from harming one another.
Yeah, so one of the, those of you who have not read The Blank Slate should read it, but one of the sections in there is how your youthful anarchism was debunked by, was it a police strike?
Montreal police strike, yes, in 1969. We Canadians are certainly capable of rioting and shooting and vandalism. When, as often happens in Quebec, a sector of the civil service goes on strike until they brought in the Mounties to restore order. Since then, that could have been a one-off. So I did a little survey of police strikes. I never published this, and just to make sure this wasn't a fluke. In about half of the ones that I could find, violence went up in the aftermath. The other half, there wasn't enough data to tell. So I don't think it was a freak occurrence of my youth. Now it was mixed in with some of the politics of the era and with some labor union stuff, but that's what happens when the police walk off their job. And in general, when I looked at the distribution over space and time of violence in The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, there's a pretty good correlation between anarchy in the sense of absence of government and anarchy in the sense of violent chaos. That the violent parts of the world, like the American Wild West, which really was violent, according to the data, the Sicilian origins of the mafia, the Scottish Highlands, the New Guinea Highlands, the Amazon rainforest, when you have no court system, no judicial system, the nearest sheriff is 100 miles away, then people have to defend themselves with a credible threat of violence, which can then escalate into vendettas and blood feuds. It can happen even within a state society in economic zones of contraband, like in drug dealers and booze rum runners during Prohibition, where you can't settle your disputes via lawsuits or call 911 if you're threatened. And so you've got zones of violence in those contraband economies for the same reason. But anyway, this is something that is often, that's amazingly, even though it's one of the oldest lessons in history, is just not registered in a lot of the debates on policing. Not debates, often they're just one-sided demands, but the idea that police, at least when they're properly regulated, as they should be, serve an indispensable function is often completely ignored.
Yeah, as I like to say, the experiment's been tried. So just go look at the results, and but that's not how people, I mean, I think you were writing around the year 2000, the crime decline had been going on for a while, and it was like, okay, the chaos of the 70s, 80s, they're debated. And now there was a recent homicide spike in the United States. I think a lot of that was organized, or not organized, but it was people in gangs. It was guys in gangs. And that's one reason it didn't touch us, quote unquote, normal people, because, the police taking off like didn't impact us nearly as much, aside from street crime. Okay, so we've been talking for a while, and Blank Slate, Ghost of the Machine, Noble Savage, these are the three things you were talking about. I've been pretty bearish about where our culture has been going, especially the last 5 years. Just Steve, like as we like end this, like give me an evaluation of these three and where we are. Retro.
Well, we've kind of gone over them, and in many cases it has not been good. Although there's a lot of diversity. You've got, because of the rise of podcasting and Substacks and blogs. There are all these forums for exchanging views that may not be the New York Review of Books, but are allowing ideas to be shared and amalgamated and criticized and evaluated. So the intellectual landscape is fractionating, where some of the mainstream outlets and universities have become more dogmatic and often divorced from reality. But there's an ecosystem of other sources where these ideas are being brooded and evaluated.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And so we can do glass half empty, glass half full. I would say for me the biggest thing that's just, I don't know about interesting, but almost like absurd, is we actually know more about human nature, like behavior genetics, evolutionary psychology, et cetera, et cetera. This isn't like we're talking about like metaphysics or something, which has been going on for thousands of years. We made progress. We know now genome-wide association. I think like the three top hits for same-sex behavior in the British Biobank. Like all the talk of the gay gene. Well, we got some genes now. We have
And it
educational
won't be. Well, I mean, one thing we have learned, is that there won't be one gene. The so-called fourth law of behavioral genetics, formulated by I think James Lee, my former student. That virtually all traits are the product of tens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of genes, each with a tiny effect, or very rare genes with a large effect, rare enough that we can't find them in our genotyping scans.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder, like, there have been some articles and pieces about how the awakening has peaked and receded. Hopefully that's true.
What has,
so
sorry?
The awakening, the great
awakening. The great awakening, yeah.
Yeah.
People call me an optimist, but just because I document positive trends. I'm not optimistic about that yet, just because there's so many positions of power that have been commandeered by some very dogmatic, aggressive people, and they're not going to relinquish these positions anytime soon. So there's a pushback. I think the optimism would be that there's a pushback, not that we haven't reached peak woke yet.
B is that, maybe, but hopefully there's a new generation that will be reading The Blank Slate, and of course your other books. I just like, I can't this is like the end of the podcast, so I'm just gonna say it's like Blank Slate's been one of the most, it has shaped my life of the mind and why I write, maybe on the internet, and why I communicate. And so I just want to thank you for that. And I know it's impacted a lot of people. This has been kind of like a little bit of a bearish podcast about where we are as a culture, but you made a difference. The books made a difference. One of the reasons that it got some negative reviews is because I think people knew that it was a powerful book. They were scared. I remember like in the New Yorker, I think Manan had a really harsh review. I remember that. And so I would suggest everyone, if you haven't read it, read it. Yes, it's more than 20 years old, but there's large aspects of it that I feel are very timely. And there is a map in there of, some of the real science that we've seen over the last 2 decades. And also it captures like a sense of wonder about the world and the scientific spirit, that whatever our ideology, whatever our race, our gender, our sex, sexual orientation, and yes, our religion. We can all be united by that. And that's what I really hope we recapture in the next couple of decades, and we get over this crap about like all our identity categories, because, I don't care. Sorry, cancel me.
Well, I'd like to say I appreciate you saying that. It means a lot to me. I'll just throw in just a couple of remarks. One is that the current edition has an update of the science of what turned out to be right, what turned out to be wrong. So it isn't, the science itself is not kind of fossilized as of 2002. The other is that partly as a result of feedback of an early draft from my colleague Orlando Patterson, the sociologist, from Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist. When I first wrote it, I was kind of bearish about the human condition. And these friends and colleagues pointed out that the idea of human nature is itself uplifting and should be stated that way. That for one thing, it means we're all humans. We all suffer.
Yeah.
We all flourish. The ideas of fundamental categories of inferior people and superior people, and I mean, we're just the big message of acknowledging human nature is we all have it. It is the ultimate statement of the unity of humankind.
Yeah, I am human and no one else is alien. So, that's just the truth. All right.
As Terence said, I am I'll update it a bit. I am a human. Nothing human is foreign to me. He said, I'm a man.
Yeah,
Nothing human is foreign to me, but that's
yeah. All right. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much, Razib. It's a great pleasure.
This podcast for kids